All right, well, let's get started. I can see plenty of people have joined. Welcome everybody to today's webinar, which is the second in our series, Exploring Competition in Digital Markets. Today's topic, as you all know, is would service-specific regulation help or harm business and innovation in Australia? We have most of our panellists back together. We're lucky enough again to have Stephen King and John Yun joining us for today's discussion. And we're also lucky to have a new participant, Greg Houston. I won't go through their full bios because that'll take us for the rest of the webinar time. But just quickly, you'll remember Stephen's currently a commissioner at the Australian Productivity Commission. John brings to us an international perspective as Associate Professor of Law and Deputy Executive Director at the Global Antitrust Institute. And Greg's a founding partner of Houston Kemp, and amongst a lot of other things, he's played a substantial role in shaping the development of economic regulatory regimes governing a whole range of industries, communications, energy, transport and water in Australia and in the Asia Pacific region. So thank you, welcome everybody again. Good to see you all. Today's discussion follows the recent publication in November of the ACCC's interim report number 5 in its series of reports on digital platform services. And everyone, I think, will have had a look at the report and knows that the report recommends regulatory reform and raises a whole range of topics for debate, some of which pick up on the themes we discussed in our earlier webinar. Today, before we get into our panel discussion of the ACCC's recommended reforms, for some context in which any reforms that might be implemented might operate, Greg's going to first outline his views on competition in the retail sector, which you remember is a sector in which online marketplaces form a part, as we discussed in our last webinar. After Greg's presentation, I'll quickly do an overview of the ACCC's recommendations, then we'll get into a panel discussion for about 40 minutes and we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. The chat box is going to be open during the panel discussion and we'll be putting your questions to the panellists with plenty of time at the end of the panel discussion to add your good questions to the matters that they're all going to consider. So with that, over to you, Greg, to present the Houston Kemp report on competition in the retail sector.
Great, thank you, Kirsten. Hello, everybody. I'll just share my screen here. Hopefully that's all working well. So I'm just going to give a short summary of a report that we prepared for Amazon on competition in retail markets in Australia, which, as Kirsten said, online retail marketplaces are part of the sort of scope of the digital platforms that are come for consideration in the ACCC's report. So I'll just got half a dozen slides which I'll take you through here. And first of all, I'll say that this report is available on the public version of this report is available on the ACCC website in the area where its digital platforms consultations taking place. So we examined competition in the retail sector in Australia, and first of all, I think it's just worth observing that this sector has been subject, like many other parts of the economy, to a great deal of technological change over many years, but particularly in the last 10, and that's really driven by the growth of online retailing. And most, I think, perhaps interestingly for the subject today, is the integration of online retailing with other channels. And what the picture we see today in the retail sector is really one where what we might call omni-channel retailing. And that's really where retailers have become channel agnostic. Essentially, many retailers offer the same service and the same prices across multiple online and offline channels. And I mean, this is a very widespread phenomenon. Most, or just about all, major bricks and mortar retailers in Australia now sell through online channels, and there's there's all sorts of other different combinations of what we might call online and online activity and different forms of online activity. And thinking about the competition side of this thing, we did that in the sort of usual way by first looking at the consumer side and how competition operates there, and then also looking at the sort of seller or retailer side as well. So on the consumer side, I think it's in thinking about consumer behaviour in markets, it's really helpful to try and identify what are the sort of points in the process by which transactions take place, at which consumers get presented with choices about how they conduct themselves. And we identified 3 points in the sort of consumer choice, or 3 points of consumer choice in the retail process, and that's all of which are very relevant for this integration of on and offline. So the first point, all captured in this diagram here, going from left to right, is that there's a sort of initial stage where consumers search for a retail item that they might be interested in. That could be anything from their grocery retailer through to any retail item you can name, and that search happens online, and there's an incredible diversity of ways in which that search place can take place. Then in the middle, we have what we call an assessment process. The consumers use or work with the information that they've found in that following their search to figure out what choice of retail item or retail, whatever it is going to be best for them. And then lastly, there's the actual those 2 things, search and assess, lead up to a sort of point where a transaction takes place. And we thought about the competition process for consumers by reference to each of those stages and the sort of extent of choices that were available to them. And I've got here an incredibly and deliberately messy slide that captures the sort of diversity of options and information and ways of operating that we identified as being available to consumers for a case study item. And that, I mean, we did a number of case studies, and these are set in our report, but this particular one is, I mean, not chosen just for its sort of ordinariness, really, a particular pair of Sony headphones. And we're not really here to expect any of you to sort of absorb all of the detail here, but the message really is just a diversity of choices and options that consumers have at each one of those search, assess, and purchase process. And many tools available for consumers to go through that search task. At the assessment stage, there's all kinds of different review options where consumers can look at look at evaluations that third parties have undertaken for this particular pair of headphones, and all kinds of other information as well. And then lastly, we have the sort of variety of methods forms by which consumers can actually undertake that transaction for a pair of headphones. And we have everything in the digital space. Starting at the left, we have all kinds of different entrances into that process through apps, social media, online marketplaces, or just the online stores of particular retailers. And of course, we have the in-store purchase processes as well. And look, it's worth saying that the lines between these are also not sharply divided. We all would have seen and experienced the sort of click and collect phenomenon where you search or transact online and then arrange to collect your item in store. And that again extends from groceries right through to all kinds of other retail items. So that the essence of that is just an incredible diversity of options and choices for consumers at every stage of that competitive decision-making process that they're engaged in. Now, on the turning now to the supply side, the first thing, and I must say this is something I've found very, very enlightening and surprising, is just when we think about what does actually the retailing service encompass. And probably the thing that really struck me is just how many different functions combine to comprise a retail service. And this picture here captures in each of the shelves on this sort of imaginary bookcase all of the different readily identifiable functions that are involved in retailing, and everything from towards the bottom, warehouse management systems, delivery and fulfillment services, right through higher up in the chain to marketing and advertising mechanisms, payment methods in between. And what's helpful to focus on in all these different components is just each one of them is available from one or more or quite a number of different third-party providers. So the retailing service as a whole, the retailing function, is actually the aggregation of a whole lot of other different functions that come together before we even think about the item that is actually being sold. And one of the things about that, of course, is that that means that it's very easy to become a retailer, because essentially you can procure all of these inputs and outsource many of the things you need to make to bring your product to the market. And one of the things that we found, we established that there are nearly 150,000 retailers in Australia, and these retailers are selling a mix of overlapping mixes of products, some more specialist, some very broad range of products, specialist online or offline retailers through to online marketplaces, and all of them able to quickly, from whatever they're doing, expand their sales or focus or broaden their operations in response to the sort of market conditions that they're experiencing. All, of course, an environment where the consumers are rapidly able to switch in order to find the best deal for them. And I think in terms of where did that draw us to in terms of a conclusion, all of the abilities to unpack and outsource all these functions mean there are incredibly low barriers to entry in retailing. There were around 25,000 new retail businesses in Australia in 2021, which is an incredible proportion of the 150,000 sort of existing businesses. So this really does present as a sort of very dynamic, highly competitive sector. And that really was the essential finding of our report, that there's strong competition in the retail sector for all of across both the sort of focus, the coming together of both the consumer side and the provider side. And all of that and its detail and the analysis we did is set out in our report. I'll hopefully escape from that, and hopefully I've done that right. No, I haven't. Just a minute. There we are. I've managed to get it off the screen.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Greg, for taking us through your report. Moving now from the retail sector to more broadly, we're going to move to our discussion about the ACCC's recommendations, which of course are broad recommendations applying to digital platform services. Now it's my turn to share my screen. So let's just get that working. And what I'm going to do, there we go. Can we all see that? Yep, good. I'm going to really quickly just run through an overview of the ACCC's recommendations. I'm sure pretty much everyone on the call has had a look. So the ACCC's report makes recommendations in 3 broad categories. And the diagram on the screen is taken from the ACCC's report. On the left, economy-wide recommended reforms to enhance consumer protections. In the middle, digital platform-specific recommendations, again, really directed at specific consumer harms. And then the competition reforms, which is what we're going to talk about today, in the box on the right there with the red border, where the ACCC has recommended, in summary, the introduction of the capacity for there to be service-specific codes with targeted obligations, which will be guided by legislative principles in order to address conduct which the ACCC describes as anti-competitive conduct, barriers to entry, and unfair treatment of business users. The competition recommendations really have a couple of key elements. The first is that the additional competition measures recommended for digital platforms focuses on service-specific codes. And so the recommendation is for a new power to make mandatory codes of conduct, which would be specific to particular digital platform services and which would apply to designated digital platforms. And the codes and the designation would be implemented in accordance with principles set out in the legislation, designed to allow flexibility to tailor the obligations to specific issues relevant to a service as they change over time. The sort of obligations that these service-specific mandatory codes might include are set out in the ACCC's recommendation 4, and we'll discuss these in some detail with the panel. But they include such conduct as anti-competitive self-preferencing, anti-competitive tying, impediments to interoperability, data-related barriers to entry and expansion if privacy impacts can be managed, lack of transparency, unfair dealings with business users, which probably overlaps with the economy-wide increased consumer protections that the ACCC recommends, exclusivity and price parity clauses. So a list of conduct which many of you would be familiar with, in your day-to-day practices or experiences as conduct that competition law might already, in some sense, capture. The process that the ACCC is recommending is nicely captured in figure 5.1 of the ACCC's report, so I've put that on this slide. The recommendation is to introduce primary legislation, which includes a power to make codes of conduct and legislative principles to guide the development of those codes, and then a designation power, which also would include designation criteria. So the idea is that a code of conduct would be developed for a service, a platform would be designated in respect of that service, and then the designated platform that provides a designated service would be subject to the obligations of the code. So that's a lightning fast and overview of the ACCC's recommendations. I'm going to stop sharing now, and we'll get into the panel discussion. First up, maybe to remind everyone, in our last webinar, we discussed the panelists' views of what was the right vision for digital platforms and regulation. John, I think for you, innovation is the golden goose, preserving competition on its merits. Stephen, I think you took us through an overview of all of the innovation and benefits we've experienced in the last long number of years, and pleaded, don't stuff it up. So our first topic is, how do you think the ACCC's recommendations shape up against your visions? And does the report convince you that we need ex-ante regulation of digital platform services in Australia? We might start with you, John.
Thank you, Kirsten, and I really appreciate being on this panel. It's really enjoyable every time I'm here. So let me start with some positives. I know we'll have a conversation where perhaps the report fell well short of what is required for the recommendations, but let me just start with 3 positive things, and then I will stop and we'll move the conversation on. I think number one, the idea that not just specific digital platforms, but perhaps all digital platforms suffer from concerns of fraud, opaque decisions on moderation policies, who gets banned, who can do certain activities. Certainly in the US with Twitter in the news, their public representations of what they were doing with people being banned and their private actual decisions, there was a big divergence. And I think that's a big concern, whether it's Twitter or smaller companies. So I think the ACCC really does get that calibration right, in my view, in this is a more general concern. I think number two, they have a very interesting part where they say, look, this regulation might not just be to these standard big tech companies, and that's really common across all reports you read across the globe, but it could be specific to certain markets. I think this is really important because that tells me they're addressing the problem, not targeting specific companies. And so if we have a market failure, we have a market failure. It doesn't matter who it is. And so this kind of opens the door. Perhaps they don't name anyone, but you would imagine someone like Spotify, who at least in the US dominates the streaming business here for music, that they could be subject to certain types of regulations. I'm not agreeing they should be, but at least on principle, I thought the ACCC was very consistent there. And I thought that was a credit to them. The final thing, and I'll stop, is that they did have, I would say, probably 6, 7 sentences that were very strong in terms of the pro-competitive effects of various policies that they discussed. Just to give you one example, they say that many acquisitions by large digital platforms are likely to be pro-competitive or benign. It was almost just, an eye-opener. You read that, and if I'm not mistaken, they don't have any recommendations on mergers for these platforms. Maybe I missed that, but that was consistent with that finding, and I thought, okay, they're being quite serious about that. Yet then they turn around, this will be my final statement, is that something like self-preferencing, they say, while not all forms of self-preferencing by platforms are problematic, some may even be benign or pro-competitive. And so instead of taking that and then maybe balancing that with what they recommend, suddenly you read at the end, we need sector-specific and firm-specific regulation, code of conduct on self-regulation. And I know they build in some flexibility to tailor it and narrow it, but I found that troubling, where they will acknowledge this, but then they move full steam ahead with the regulation. And I think that's something that really surprised me. But there are elements, to close, that I found positive in the report.
Thanks very much, John. Stephen, what did you think?
Yeah, so I largely agree with John on the consumer side. So, no-brainers, unfair trading, making sure that we get rid of fake reviews to the degree possible, get rid of the scams. That's all great. So you said we'd concentrate on the competition side, and I suspect that's where the disagreement between both us as panelists and the ACCC, and I suspect between us as panelists, will be. I think the ACCC overall has what it's tried to do is set up an ex-ante approach to regulation of certain sectors, as John mentioned. I think in doing so, it's ignored the tools that it's got. It hasn't addressed gaps in the most appropriate way, and I think it's shown the limitations of ex-ante. So just briefly on each of those, it hasn't used the tools it's got. So 2017, Section 46 came in. We have one of the, if not the strongest, abusive market power laws in the world. We have no precedent of any use. I don't take some ports down in Tasmania, which were all government owned, as being a great example of any useful information about where Section 46 applies. But I would have thought that the starting point for the ACCC and digital platforms is to think about Section 46, and I would have liked to have seen a couple of cases. And the cases are there. We've seen them in the EU. We've seen Google Shopping in the EU. Why wasn't an equivalent case run here? We've had some cases that could have been run in Australia when Unlocked, the Lachlan Murdoch, I think it was, backed application, which was a great idea. You got paid a small amount if you watch some ads before unlocking your phone. It got knocked off by, I think, Google through Android in that situation, removed from the App Store for violating for App Store policy. I would have liked to have seen that case run. The ACCC may have good reasons why it didn't run it, but I'm unaware of them. There are opportunities out there for Section 46 to get precedent out there, and they haven't used those. I guess second point is that on the gaps, as John mentioned, there are gaps in merger policy in Australia. I think it's a matter of degree as to whether we need a massive overhaul, as the former chairman of the ACCC said, or we need some fiddling around the edges. But I think everyone agrees that there's some action that needed in mergers, but it's missing an action in this report, which is really disappointing. And the final thing, just on ex-ante regulation, they've tried to set up, it shows the problem of ex-ante regulation, because they've tried to set up ex-ante regulation, but not using per se offences, which you can imagine in standard in the Competition Act, but using the sort of language and the sort of judgment which necessarily precludes effective ex-ante regulation. So, for example, when they talk about anti-competitive self-preferencing, and they have a code that will presumably say anti-competitive self-preferencing, and it may even give some examples of it, and it may try and tie it down, but it will be loose. And there will be fights about what is anti-competitive as opposed to pro-competitive or benign self-preferencing. Now, what they've done is they've simply set up an alternative procedure, which will be as complex as the courts, as complex as the current Act, will not be ex-ante, will inevitably be ex-post, because somebody's got to work out, was that anti-competitive or not?
Thanks, Stephen. Greg, over to you. You didn't get the opportunity to express your vision in our last webinar, but what's your reaction to the ACCC's recommendations?
Well, I mean, I'm sort of pretty broadly very comfortable with the points that John and Stephen has made, and perhaps just the simplest thing that I can add at this point is that whenever you're contemplating sector-specific regulatory intervention, it's always very helpful in some way or other to think about the costs and the benefits, and really to make some effort into identifying them and weighing them before you sort of rush in, or even make as recommendations as firm has been. And Stephen's identified quite well some of the sort of challenges in administering some of these sector-specific regulations, which are not unlike the challenges in administering generic competition law, and that's because the issues are genuinely difficult. So in that sense, I think what I don't see in the ACCC's report is much by the way of strong conclusions as to the existence of, other than the sort of consumer protection side, but on the competition side, I don't see much by way of strong conclusions as to there are actually competition problems that exist in markets that they've sort of identified very, very carefully, and that will be always the start of any of this cost-benefit assessment.
Thanks, Greg. Maybe moving to undertaking an assessment of costs and benefits. I think we discussed in our last webinar, I think everyone agreed that's something that should be done. That's something very difficult to be done. Are there any shortcut ways of doing that? Greg, do you have any ideas?
Well, I mean, I think it's also always useful to go back to the sort of basics of what are the conditions that you need to identify in regulatory intervention in a competition context, or when we're actually trying to deal with firm conduct. So essentially, there's a sort of widespread and well-accepted presumption that regulatory intervention designed to improve competition should only really be expected to deliver benefits when there are firms, one or more firms, that have got substantial and enduring market power. That's almost a sort of foundational finding or presumption that you need to have And that just comes from the widely accepted principles on which our generic competition law is based. Competition is the best means for delivering the dynamism and innovation that serves the interests of consumers. And this is certainly a sector of the economy where both those things have been strongly present. And we also need to have that. We also remember that the prospect of some market power is always needs to be there. It's an important driver for innovation and for firms to sort of provide better products at lower costs. So it's well understood that we need to ensure that the market power that we find is substantial, and that's what that principle we have reflected in our law. So that foundational requirement that we identify or are confident that there's substantial and enduring market power is an important sort of presumption for intervention to have the potential for benefits, net benefits. And then, of course, as Stephen's alluded to, we need to be confident that the form of regulatory intervention, whether it's codes or what have you, can be framed in a way that doesn't have or has a much lower administrative costs than what our general competition law would have, and doesn't actually, just because it's sector specific, doesn't end up just encouraging conduct that will circumvent whatever constraints put in there. Well, that's a long way of saying what we all often refer to as sort of avoiding the law of unintended consequences. So unless we have, they're the things that I would look for as a sort of broad presumptive requirement for there to be net benefits. And to be honest, the ACCC's report's actually pretty cautious in the way it describes the extent of some of these potential problems. There's a lot of mays and coulds in when the ACCC is referring to the existence of market power and its substantiality and the prospect of harm.
Thanks, Greg. John, what do you think of the way Greg put it, the broad presumptive requirements as he outlined?
No, I agree, and I would say even more specifically, Greg mentioned sector specific. The report calls for firm specific regulation. Once you are a designated digital platform, you are a firm that will be targeted with this specific code of conduct that some regulatory body will impose with fines and remedies and some punitive. And so to me, if you're going that level of detail, that level of intervention in markets, the burden should be really high on the regulatory body who's making that recommendation. There has to be a demonstrative efficiency that needs to be solved. In fact, there's this guidance note from the Department of the Prime Minister of Cabinet and the Office of Best Practice Regulation, which I think is renamed, right, Office of Impact Regulation now. But they write, the Australian government is committed to the use of cost-benefit analysis. This is just 2022, to assess regulatory proposals to encourage better decision-making. In principle, cost-benefit measures the efficiency or resource allocation effects of a regulatory change. It calculates the dollar value of gains and losses of all people affected, and I could go on. Those principles are sound and excellent, and to me, this report falls short of that ideal and that objective. Unfortunately, not only is that missing, but it's so focused on one party, which is, to me, the competitors. Repeatedly, it discusses the harm to competitors, but to me, the loss to competitors is really a feature of markets, not a bug. We don't have to get into the whole nature of competition in markets, but I find that really troubling that the consumer aspect, it's not ignored, but it seems to be heavily discounted in the report. And to me, that's something that's missing.
Thanks, John. Stephen.
Yeah, so as a commissioner of the Productivity Commission, if I didn't say strongly support cost-benefit analysis, I would be have my membership of the commission ripped off me next time I walked into the office. So clearly agree on that. The one thing that hasn't been raised on cost benefit analysis so far, and I broadly agree with everything that John and Greg has said, so we'll have to get some disagreement going in a second. Maybe this will do it. But I agree the consumers out of focus. I agree the ACCC is very cautious, and in some ways, and rightly so, because consumers are so much better off for the activities of these same businesses that they're saying, well, we've got market power and are misbehaving. So let's assume they've got market power. Let's take interim reports 1 to 4 and say, yeah, we're convinced there is such a thing as a social media display advertising market where Meta has some market power, and it would be interesting to see what courts made of that. But let's assume that. The ACCC, in any sort of analysis and any sort of working out what approach to take for regulation, if there's a need for regulation, so you've got general competition laws, if there's a need for something else, it's not just, we don't think the current laws are working well enough, we will design an edifice to be able to solve this problem. And let's say, again, that was worth it. Let's say that the benefits of this sector-specific codes and then designation, let's imagine that was better than the broad competition law. And again, I've already said, I've got my doubts there. What are the alternative forms of regulation that the ACCC could have considered that don't appear anywhere in this report, and which would have been potentially simpler, would have dealt with the issues as they see them just as well, and would have had more flexibility? And let me put forward a simple one. There seem to be 4 companies that have problems for the ACCC: Google, Facebook, Meta, Apple. Okay, big 4. Whether it's a political problem or whether it's a competition problem. Let's say we've got those 4 firms with problems. How about we come up with a situation where we go to each of those firms and say, we need you to sit down with the regulators and start working out what you will and will not do. We want to try and align what you do here with what you do in the EU under their laws and with the UK under their laws. And we're not going to set up a whole bunch of new legislation, but we do want you guys to agree to behave in certain ways. And it may be that you'll behave in a way that you won't buy priority placement. It may be that you will choose to allow options when a user first signs in as to what search engine or what browser they wish to use. We could have gone down that lighter-handed track, recognising that there's a whole bunch of regulation around the world. So South Korea changes the rules for Apple, and guess what? Apple changes what it does around the world. We could have done that. That wasn't, I don't know if the ACCC didn't consider that, but it's certainly not an option then. And I suspect it would have been a much lower cost option, which probably would have got us to about the same place. And you're on mute, Kirsten. Either that or I've shocked you so much.
No, well, no, you never shock me, Stephen. John and Greg, do you want to comment on Stephen's alternative?
Greg, I'll let you go first on this one.
Well, I'm not sure I like Stephen's alternatives that much, actually, which is, calling these people in and pulling the naughty firms in and asking, asking them or trying to negotiate with them about how they want to change their conduct. Sounds a bit risky to me in terms of, that you might have departed from your sort of framework for thinking about what's good and what's not good in a competition sense. So I bristle a bit about that suggestion, Stephen, and I think it's it also sounds like a little bit of a softer version of what's already being put out there, which is, we can, on some, and I'm going to come to this, I know some sort of fairly loose criteria we might designate, or some criteria looks rather loose, we might designate people, and then we call them in and we try and negotiate a code. So I'm worried, Stephen, that what you're suggesting is a little bit of just a sort of slightly watered down version, and but could have as the same number of or the similar kind of pitfalls.
So my reaction is similar to Greg's in that there's this theory from George Stigler, theory of regulation, where incumbents ultimately benefit from regulation. It entrenches their position. And one of the concerns I had about the report is that I understand the ACCC's desire for flexibility. So their code of conduct isn't set in stone. It's flexible. It can be narrowed. It can be negotiated. There's public comment. There's working with the companies to assure that we can preserve the pro-competitive while addressing the anti-competitive. And in theory, this is a navigation of really two difficult problems. I understand that, and at least conceptually it makes some sense. But I think the reality of the implementation, whenever you have a regulatory body working closely with the leading firm of a market, to me just worries me. I don't have a specific theory other than George Stigler to suggest, but as an economist, this is a public choice problem where those who are regulated become intimately tied with those who they are regulating. And I just think that can be a recipe for trouble, just as a general principle. I don't have any specifics.
And I think just to sort of perhaps interrupt, I think we saw a little bit of that in a predecessor instrument, which was the news media bargaining code, and it was actually maybe represents a point in time of an instrument and approach that might have some similarities here, where I think if I recall rightly, you had to be designated as that code being applied to you, and we had the chair of the ACCC over quite a lengthy period sort of making lots of public statements about specific entities, or at least the existence of entities who they knew who they were, that had or had not reached deals with news media organisations, and therefore he would or would not have a greater appetite to designate those or have those parties designated under the code. And I think that sort of public regulatory body, in effect publicly or privately negotiating to get particular outcomes, is something we should generally be pretty cautious of in our public administration generally. And no less so in competition law, where the issues are always complex.
Okay. It's good we've got a bit of debate going there. The point, I guess my base point is, going back to yours, Greg, you sort of said it sounds a bit like what they've got a light hand or a light version. Yeah, I agree. And it may be a terrible set of regulation. Is it better than what the ACCC's put in place? Because that's the question. We're not saying de novo, is this a great set of regulation? What we're doing is we're saying we can have a whole lot of new legislation, new codes of conduct, designation criteria, a body set up to designate businesses, another body to enforce, probably the ACCC will be the latter, then an appeals mechanism. We can then get precedent about what all of these terms such as anti-competitive, self-preferencing mean. We can go down the ACCC track. All I'm saying is, if you want to go down that track, if there's a problem with the four firms that keep coming up again and again in the ACCC's report, is there a cheaper, more effective way to get to the outcome that the ACCC's after without setting up just, I've said an edifice which will be grand and wonderful and may not work?
Thanks, Stephen. We'll let everyone out there think about those ideas, continue to think about those ideas, but maybe moving on. Greg gave us the outline of the Houston Kemp report on the state of competition in the retail sector. Let's discuss what we think about the ACCC's recommendations as they might apply to the retail sector. Do they deliver the best outcome for Australian businesses and consumers in that sector? Perhaps, Greg, do you want to start on that topic?
Sure. Well, on its face, it's difficult to see where there are competition problems in the retail sector, and so it's not obvious at all how any of this might presumptively be taken to apply. our analysis found it's a highly competitive sector, and we didn't define markets because even when you look at the either the consumer or the provider side, that's a very complex question. But it doesn't really matter in the sense that it's hard to find any way of looking at this sector that says it's not highly competitive. And of course, the one part of the sector that fits within the sort of digital platform slice is online marketplaces. But I mean, in short, our analysis has found no basis to sort of single them out from a competition perspective as part of a much wider and more vibrant sector. And the ACCC actually doesn't make any findings that would contradict that conclusion as well. And I think that's quite important. So in a sense, I take some comfort from the conclusions we drew in our report that they don't seem that controversial, in the sense there's nothing in the ACCC's work that would suggest anything different. So all of that I take to mean that it's really hard to see how online marketplaces, which is one part of the retail sector of a very diverse, actually would come to get any attention from anything that may move forward from this.
Thanks, Greg. Stephen, what do you think?
Yeah, so agree with Greg on this, and we commented earlier on their marketplace inquiry, and I've now made sure I don't put Facebook/Meta in my notes and call them two different companies. So sorry, Google, Meta, and Apple are the three companies that the ACCC has concerns with. Their marketplace analysis kept on. I got the impression it tried to make a case against Amazon, but it was so weak. Even as digital marketplaces, and then you put digital marketplaces in Australia in the context of all the retail sectors, as Greg did in his slide, and you've got to say there just isn't a problem there. And again, as we mentioned in the earlier session, you look at the sort of conduct that could apply here to digital marketplaces such as self-preferencing, and you think, well, that's what's done all the time in our bricks and mortar stores, who have got far more sales than the online marketplaces. So it doesn't feature in this report. I think it's a good thing it doesn't feature in this report, and I can't see there being a problem, certainly not at the moment. I'd be surprised, quite frankly. I know there's arguably problems overseas in the US and Italy, but there's just not a problem in Australia that the ACCC should be worrying about.
Thanks, Stephen. John?
Yeah, the problem is that Stephen and Greg are just too sensible. It's hard to come up with disagreements here. And in fact, the more Stephen was talking about his alternative proposal, the more I liked it. So I don't know what's going on here. So, but just briefly, I agree with comments that were said. And just to hone in on self-preferencing just for a moment, and again, I will be brief on this. As Stephen said, this is behavior that really is just fundamental to businesses. If you imagine what vertical integration is, and that's the idea of where you just make most of your parts and components, it is the ultimate self-preferencing. When Apple has this entire closed ecosystem of their watch, their iPads, their iPhones, their MacBooks, it is really preferencing their own products. And so in some ways, we're punishing firms that have a hybrid model, like, let's say, Google and Amazon. Amazon, when they open their stores, it's not just Amazon stuff, but third-party marketplace platform business that they're bringing together. And so there are those concerns. And in fact, the current chair of the FTC made her name with an article challenging the practices of Amazon in terms of self-preferencing with its marketplace and disadvantaging third-party sellers from coming aboard. But I think fundamentally, when we're saying that entry of low-price products like what Amazon was doing is welfare a loss for consumers, again, I think it's not that that can't happen. The burden has to be more than just, look, it's disadvantaging the other third-party sellers. Well, that's what it's supposed to do. And so I really think we need to challenge the idea that entry and low-cost products is somehow bad for consumers. I really reject that premise, absent really strong evidence.
All right, thanks, John. Anyone else want to say anything about self-preferencing before we move on?
Well, it's harmful. It can be harmful if you have substantial market power, and that's where the sort of presumptive theory is at. And I think that's it in a nutshell. And until we get comfortable that whatever digital platform or sector of digital platform market that we're concerned about might be self-preferencing, we need to focus on that prior question and quite carefully.
Yeah, so self-preferencing is not necessarily bad. It could be anti-competitive. So I mentioned Google Shopping before. So why do I think Google Shopping was a case which we could have run here, and which I'm quite glad that the EU decision last time I looked, unless there's been an appeal decision that I don't know about, but last time I looked, Google was found guilty of breaching the EU laws. Why? Well, because they didn't just say, hey, we're going to put our ads, set up our shopping service, which will do the same as all of these other third-party shopping services. They said, we're going to set up our shopping service, and just as a matter of interest, our algorithm has now decided that all of those other shopping services are no longer on page 1, but they're now on page 5 of our search results. So why is Google Shopping a great case? Because it's not just the self-preferencing, it's a self-preferencing plus more, where the more, it appears, was taking action so that they are using their market power on search to disadvantage their competitors. And so I think that's the sort of nuance you want. You don't want something to say self-preferencing is bad, because it's not necessarily. You want something to say anti-competitive self-preferencing is bad, but then it's all in the detail, and how, again, it's not ex ante regulation. If you've got to come along ex post and say, how do we sort out the good stuff from the bad stuff, and who makes that decision?
All right. What do we all think the government should be thinking about in considering the ACCC's recommendations, or any other recommendations, in ensuring anything that's done is fit for purpose in Australia? Greg, I might go to you first.
Thanks, Kirsten. Well, I think that if we just sort of summarise the context here, the ACCC has identified 3 firms with market power, Google, Apple and Meta. But I think, and I start there because if the government was to accept broadly where the ACCC has suggested it should go, the key thing for the government would be the designation process at which firms or services, but I think it's actually firms, would be brought into this net, because if that doesn't happen, all of this has no effect. So I think my sense would be the government should make sure that those designation criteria properly identify the existence of a presumptive basis for a problem, which is that the relevant firm has substantial market power in a market that is properly defined. Now, so what's the gap between where the ACCC has made some findings in the past and what the government may have to do next? It really is, well, there's some work to be done to establish that this contended market power is actually a robust conclusion. And I think there's a lot of work that still is needed on that. I mean, there'll always be debate about the definition of markets and the Some have been put forward, but they do inevitably needed to be tested and a little more rigorously. They've not really been tested as such. They've just been put out there by the ACCC. And then, of course, then would come the looking at the strengths of the constraints on those firms and so on. So I think that's the sort of gap that we have between where the ACCC's work so far has got to and what the government might ultimately do. And I think the one thing that I would say is that a lot has changed in the 5 years since the ACCC started out on this process. And I only make these observations in a sort of casual way, but digital platforms and the concern started even before there was TikTok, for example, which is a new digital platform that's undoubtedly taken a lot of share off others. Another thing that I did have to laugh when to myself when the ACCC observes, even in the executive summary, that talking about the size and importance of these digital platforms, and they compare the market capitalisation of I forget, it was maybe Facebook, and I forget which 2 or 3 it was, and compared that to the size of the Australian economy, and that's actually an apples and oranges comparison, and it's not valid in the first place, but even so, many of us will be aware that if we look at something like Meta, the market capitalisation of that firm, and therefore its shareholders' view of its future prospects has very dramatically declined in the last year, and not even dramatic when compared to other sort of tech stocks. So, that is telling us that there's a lot of changes afoot in Meta's world, and maybe even if it did have market power 2 years ago, on the face of it, it faces a very different set of circumstances now. So there's some updating, not only more analysis, but more up-to-date analysis that I think is requirement here. And the government, I think the ACCC would have been perhaps better to have been a bit more open about the fact that things are changing. Some of its observations from the past may not apply, but certainly the government needs to take all of those considerations quite seriously in working out how to push forward.
Thanks, Greg. Stephen, what do you think?
Yeah, so I get, okay, so on this particular issue of what the ACCC's done, I'm an old guy now, so I want to go back into a bit of history. So, we've dealt with this problem before. And what did we do? So we said there are businesses that presumptively have market power that we've got some problems with, and they were electricity utilities, and they were railway companies, and they were gas pipeline companies, and they were generally government owned. And we said, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to set up a system whereby we identify these companies, and then we're going to have particular regulation put in place around these companies. And it was, of course, the Hilmer access regime. And that went forward, and with a set of declaration criteria as opposed to designation criteria, and then a set of, once you are declared, a process which actually looks a lot more like my suggested, just get the guys in and chat to them. Not quite, but it is, a compulsory negotiate, arbitrate, where at the end of the day, the regulator has to bring the sides together and come up with something. But what have we learnt from Part 3A? We've learned it's really, 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 really hard to come up with a set of designation criteria that just capture what you want to capture, and then to have a code after that that's going to try and tie down the behaviour of those designated businesses is also going to be really, really, really hard. So we've had 25 minutes or so, 25 years or so, sorry, of, what would it be? A bit over 25 years, about 26 years of Part 3A, of it being fought through the courts about whether a firm meets the declaration criteria. Here's my prediction. We will spend the next 25 years going through the courts, arguing about the designation criteria. And the ACCC may fool themselves into thinking, no, we can write down really tight rules for designation. And they are wrong, because there are really smart people, most of them lawyers, occasionally economists, but lots of lawyers who will run trucks through those and tie it up in the courts. Even if they don't allow a merits review, there will be points of law, it will get to the courts. And when it gets to the courts, it's going to take time. So, you know, the one bit of our access regime from Hilmer that worked was actually where we deemed declared. We just simply said, look, electricity grids, they're declared. ARTC's roll network, that's declared. Now let's just move on. And in some ways, the ACCC's not learned from that experience, and it's trying to set up the Part 3A type edifice again. I think it's doing a worse job because it's gone from designation to industry-specific codes, and God knows how they do them. Whilst we've been on the call, one of my former colleagues at the ACCC was obviously very annoyed with what I was saying and texted through, no, you've got it wrong. It's going to be highly specific and detailed codes on what a business can and cannot do. And I texted back, you are wrong. You cannot do it. It will, you know, there are smart lawyers out there who are going to become very rich out of this. And I wish the lawyers well, but, you know, it's, you know, this idea that you can just set up a designation regime, it's just not going to, it's not going to be low cost. I think it's going to be very high cost, and I think it's going to be very litigious.
Thanks, Stephen. Maybe John, or if you want to add to that. Otherwise, I'm going to go to a question in the chat box, which will go first to you, John. Anyway, so we go to the chat box question.
Okay.
Yeah. So the question that has been asked is this. A lot of the competition reform proposals, both in Australia and overseas, treat digital platforms as an area of economic activity or a market or a sector, which leads to the idea that they should be regulated in the same way as we might regulate telecoms, for example. Another view is that a digital platform is simply a different way of providing a product or service, in the same way that the production line was a different way of making cars. Do we need to consider a different perspective on regulation that focuses on competition regulation as the solution? John, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. I actually agree with the insights from the question, in the sense that, in my view, a platform is a business model. So I think one of the frustrations I run across is the view that when you are a platform, you operate sort of in your own market, and only other platforms compete with other platforms. We have seen this mistake in certain U.S. cases. U.S. versus Sabre is a very sort of notorious case here in the U.S. for making that mistake. For example, taxi cabs are not platforms, whereas Uber and Lyft are platforms. I would suggest that they are probably competing for passengers for rides. Yet repeatedly, I see business models being used to define certain types of markets. Let me just to give you another example. Stephen mentioned the EU and Google Shopping. While one can debate the merits of the case, I think one problematic rationale for bringing that case, I read the decision, is that Amazon is not a constraint, according to the EU, on Google, because Google operates as a different model, business model, than Amazon. Amazon is primarily a retailer, according to the EU, and so consumers do not go on Amazon for product discovery in the same way they do for Google. I just fundamentally reject that presumption that platforms lead us to certain competition conclusions. It is a way to organize production that can be quite efficient, but there are other ways to organize production. And in fact, certain platforms are both single-sided and multi-sided, depending on the types of markets. So to me, this is a real fundamental point that competition agencies should really focus in on, is that let's not look at platforms in of themselves as defining power in markets, but rather one of a piece of a larger competitive market.
Thanks very much, John. Greg, Stephen, anything to add?
Just, yeah, platforms aren't new. Digital ones maybe. Platforms aren't new. Medieval towns that set up markets and would then charge traders who would come in from surrounding districts, and consumers would come in from surrounding districts, and they'd bring together the buyers and the sellers. It's a marketplace. It just didn't happen to be digital. Shopping malls are a modern equivalent of that. Credit cards have become digital over time as technology's changed, but they originally started off as largely analog platforms. We're doing a ports report or a maritime report at the Productivity Commission. Guess what? Container terminal operators are platforms. Sort of a moment when we realised, of course, they're bringing together the ships on the quay side, and they're bringing together the trucks on the land side, and they're bringing together the guys who are dropping off the containers and picking them up. And you start thinking about it that way, and you realise, oh, now we can understand what's going on with these firms. Platforms are just a way of organising business. The fact that they're digital or not digital, who cares? But you should not be saying we're going to have specific regulation for businesses that organise one way rather than another way. We're interested in consumers and consumer harm, not how businesses organise.
Okay. Might go, Greg, I might give you the next question from the chat box, which is this. Cheryl's wondering about whether you could provide some insight on this. The ACCC is proposing to develop services-specific codes, but only designated entities will have to comply with them. Is the designation step necessary? Could the code simply apply economy-wide? If there are designation criteria, should the same criteria apply in modified form to other sectors?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the answer to that, or the insights here, sort of lie in the observation that the codes that will be triggered by the designation criteria, or the designation process, are going to have do's and don'ts that are specific, but in their detail to the conduct of some sector or firm or service, and which is sort of obvious now. So because the codes are service specific, they don't lend themselves to being adopted economy-wide. I mean, the economy-wide seems to me recommendations around doing things that prevent sort of fake reviews and the sort of more consumer protection. You'd have to ask yourself, well, wouldn't they just be applicable economy-wide? But when you come to sort of competition or a process designed to alter or constrain behaviour in a market in which people are competing, unless it's a generic set of checks and balances like we have in our existing competition law, you've got a real question about, well, who you actually are trying to capture this. And if you say, we don't mind if we capture everyone, then necessarily your codes are going to be so general that they probably start to look like the generic competition law that we started off with. And so I think what I take from the observation is really, it says, well, it actually takes you back to the basic questions. Why isn't our existing competition law good enough to deal with these problems, which is where Stephen started. And I think it's a question that is not ultimately that well answered by the ACCC, because a lot of their answers are, well, all this would take time and it'd be complicated and takes a lot of time to get the cases through the courts and so on. But everything we've discussed today would suggest that the same kind of problems are going to exist with these service-specific or firm-specific instruments and processes that we've been talking about. So again, return to the original thing. What's wrong with what we have now, other than just need someone to pick up a ball and pick up an issue and take a case?
Okay, now I have one question which I'll direct at John just briefly, and then I think we'll have to wrap up looking at the time. John, the report looks at features of the regimes in Europe, in the UK, in US, in Japan and the like. What do you think about an approach which either takes aspects of those and puts them together in an Australian specific way, or seeks to replicate parts of those? What's your view on the interaction between whatever happens in Australia and the regimes that are or are being put in place elsewhere?
Thank you, Kirsten. One of the parts of the report that really frustrated me the most was the lack of real sort of analysis of cost benefit. But one of the benefits they allege of moving forward with this regulation and code of conduct is that Europe and other jurisdictions are already moving in this direction, with Europe, of course, with the DMA and DSA and to a lesser extent GDPR. And for me, I find that completely unconvincing as a rationale for Australia. Those regulations are tailored certainly to those countries, but even beyond that, the fact that others are regulating in a certain way, to me, gives no evidence in either way that this is good or bad for Australian consumers. And I find that really troubling, because that to me is fundamental to regulatory policy, is the cost benefit to the specific jurisdiction in which you are working. And so I was just really puzzled by that. I was troubled by that. I have the sense that maybe Australia could actually benefit from waiting and being patient. I know maybe that's not the most popular view, to be patient about regulatory, because there's this sense that we need to do something. But to me, that was a real shortcoming of the report.
Thanks very much, John. So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, panelists, but just to try to encapsulate, I think, where we've ended up in today's discussion, we think the ACCC's generally got it right on the consumer side in identifying some obviously reasonable concerns like scams and fraud that could potentially be addressed through ex-ante regulation. But we've got difficulties on the competition side. We think that the benefits of the ACCC's recommendations don't outweigh the costs, or certainly the cost benefit hasn't been demonstrated. We think that if there is to be regulation, you need as an absolute core substantial and enduring market power and harm to consumers as the core principle. We think that the process of preparing service-specific codes and designating platforms in relation to specific services, just as a practical matter, will take a really long time, as Stephen has said, 25 years or more, to implement and enforce. And where we end up with the strong misuse of market power provision that we have in Section 46 in Australia, that provision may be the best way to deal with conduct of concern of the type that the ACCC has identified, and perhaps that should be used a bit more. Is that a fair wrap up of where we've got to, everyone? And does anyone want to have a final sentence or two?
I'll jump in. I'm always after a final sentence or two, Kirsten. Yeah, I think that's a good summary. I guess the one thing I'll add is, if they do, if we are going to go down the approach, we're saying no, we need specific laws for Meta, Apple, Google, some other digital platform in maybe 5 years or 10 years time or whatever. Don't set up a great big bureaucracy and with masses of criteria, and that's where they've gone. And I just think that's a fundamental mistake, and we need to learn from history. The other thing I'd say, because I disagree with John a bit on the international, I thought the ACCC, the argument of it doing it overseas, so we should do it too, is a terrible argument. So agree on that completely. But the ACCC do say at various stages, we want to try and keep in line with overseas. So, okay, I didn't get a winner with my come in and chat to the regulator one. How about we simply just have a rule where we say, look, the UK, the EU, the US will, South Korea has already shown it has. They've got these things covered. The rest of it, Apple is not going to say, hey, we are having an Australia-specific operating system. We're a tiny country at the bottom end of the world. One solution here is just to sort of say, well, The overseas countries are moving on this. Yeah, if you do this in Europe and it seems like a good idea, whatever it happens to be, maybe offering choice of browser on first login on a phone. Yeah, okay, you can do that here too. By the way, it costs you almost nothing because you've already got the software and everything in place, and you're probably going to do it in Australia anyway. So yeah, I think the ACCC could have taken on board overseas evidence. I just think it could have gone further.
Thanks, John. Greg, best way to serve innovation and competition in Australia? Yeah.
Well, I think caution is a good sort of guiding principle. But I think related to that, I think we also should think a little bit here about the institutional process by which we've got to where we are and how to move forward. So we've had essentially the ACCC being front and centre of this process for quite a few years now. The recommended regulatory change, they've done the studying of the sector, they've recommended they develop codes with the ACCC that is the decision maker as to designation. The ACCC is the enforcer of our generic competition laws, and we don't have any sort of serious cost benefit analysis of these proposals. I do wonder if it isn't time to invoke perhaps the perspective of an independent body. Stephen's a commissioner of one of the best the best in the land for thinking independently about economic issues and publishing their views. And I really do wonder if we should. It's time to just pause a little bit and get an external independent view of essentially a series of studies and recommendations that essentially involve our principal competition agency continuing to set out a very big work agenda for itself going forward. And maybe we just need to ask if we shouldn't be cautious on that basis.
Thanks, Greg. John, final word on how you think innovation and competition is best served?
Well, thank you. And I will just share with you and the audience a quote from the Australian National Competition Policy Review of 1993, which first recommended the establishment of an Australian Competition Commission. And they noted, and I quote, "The greatest impediment to enhance competition in many sectors of the economy are the restrictions imposed through government regulation." I think that warning is just as relevant in 2022 as it was in 1993. And so that's my view in terms of innovation. I generally think without strong evidence otherwise, it's not that regulation is bad, the presumption should be let the markets work.
Well, thank you so much to our three panelists for yet another entertaining and lively discussion. Thank you all to the audience for participating in today's webinar. That's all for now, and perhaps there'll be another instalment in the new year. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, folks.
Perfect. Thank you, Kirsty.